good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember, Context is Everything Media Network founder and CEO John Michael. Nothing like a good cup of hot coffee. Is reading a textbook, cover to cover. Today, chapter 31, page 791, section 5. Yesterday, World War II is ended with bombs. Today, section 5, from World War to Cold War. And then we'll be ending this unit, big moment here today. Ending Unit 7, going into Unit 8, the final unit of this entire textbook. Thank you. Please subscribe. We're at 59 subscribers right now, and thank you, everyone. Thank you very much for subscribing, for listening, or even for just subscribing. If we get to 60, I give a big thumbs up tomorrow. 2. But right now, no thumbs up. But thank you. Chapter 31, Section 5, from Cold War to World War, or from World War to Cold War, setting the scene. Give me 10 years, and you will not be able to recognize Germany, said Hitler in 1933. His prophecy proved correct, although not in the way he had intended. In 1945, Germany was unrecognizably in ruin. Poland, Russia, Japan, and many other countries also lay in total ruins. Total war had gutted cities, factories, harbors, bridges, railroads, farms, homes, and lives. Millions of refugees were displaced by the fighting, liberated from prison camps, wandered the land. Amid the devastation of hunger and disease, took large tolls after the fighting ended. Aftermath of war. New heading. Even as the Allies celebrated victory, the appalling costs of war began to emerge. It had killed as many as 75 million people around the world. In Europe, about 38 million people lost their lives, many of them civilians. The Soviet Union suffered the worst casualties with more than 22 million dead. Numbers alone did not tell the story of the Nazi nightmare in Europe or the Japanese brutality in Asia. The aftermath of war investigation brought new atrocities to light, horrors of the Holocaust. During the war, the Allies were aware of the existence of Nazi concentration camps and death camps, but only at war's end did they learn the full extent of the inhumanity and misery of the Holocaust. The United States General Dwight Eisenhower, who visited the camps, was stunned to come face to face with indisputable evidence of Nazi brutality and ruthless disregard for every sense of decency. Walking skeletons stumbled out of the death camps with tales of mass murder. Rudolf Hoess, Nazi commander at Auschwitz, would later admit that he had supervised the killing of some 2.5 million people, not counting those who died of disease or starvation. War crime trials. At wartime meetings, the Allies had agreed that the Axis leaders should be tried for crimes against humanity. In Germany, the Allies held war crime trials in Nuremberg, where Hitler was staged mass rallies in 1930s. A total of 177 Germans and Austrians were tried. 142 were found guilty. A handful of top Nazis received death sentences. Others were imprisoned. Similar war crimes were held in Japan and Italy. The trials showed that political and military leaders could be held accountable for actions in wartime. I wonder if they're going to mention hiring the Nazi scientists in the United States. The war crimes trial served as an additional purpose. By exposing the savagery of the Axis regimes, they further discredited the Nazi fascist and military ideologies that had led to the war. Yet disturbing questions haunted people then as now. What made Nazi horrors possible? Why did ordinary people in Germany, Poland, France, and elsewhere accept and even collaborate in Hitler's final solution? How could the world prevent the rise of future dictators? The Allies tried to address these issues as their troops occupied Germany and Japan. The United States felt strengthening democracy would ensure tolerance and peace. The Western Allies built new governments and democratic constitutions to protect the rights of all citizens. In German schools, for example, Nazi textbooks and courses were replaced with new curriculum that taught democratic principles. The United Nations. As in 1919, the World War II, the Allies set up an international organization to ensure peace. In April 1945, delegates from 50 nations met in San Francisco to draft a charter for the United Nations. The UN would play a great role in world affairs than did its predecessor, the League of Nations. Under the UN Charter, each member nations had one vote in General Assembly. A much smaller body called the Security Council was given greater power. Each of its 5 permanent members, the United States, the Soviet Union, today Russia, Britain, France, and China, had the right to veto any council decision. Let me say that again. Each of the 5 permanent members of the UN, the United States, the Soviet Union, Russia today, Britain, France, and China, had the right to veto any council decision. The goal was to give these great powers the authority to ensure the peace. Often, however, differences among these nations have kept the UN from taking action. The UN's work would go far beyond peacekeeping. The organization would take on many world problems, from preventing outbreak of disease and improving education to protecting refugees and aiding nations to develop economically. The UN agencies like the World Health Organization and the Food and Agriculture Organization have provided help for millions of people around the world. I'm sure that they're trying. And I'm sure that they've helped. The alliance breaks apart. Amid the rubber war, a new power structure emerged. In Europe, Germany was defeated. France and Britain were drained and exhausted. 2 other powers, the United States and the Soviet Union, brought about a final victory before long. These 2 nations would become superpowers, with the economic resources and military might to dominate the globe. They would also become tense rivals in an increasingly divided world. Growing differences. During the war, the Soviet Union and the nations of the West had cooperated to defeat Nazi Germany. And by 1945, during the wartime alliance, by 1945, however, the wartime alliance was crumbling. Conflicting ideologies and mutual destruction soon led to conflict known as the Cold War. The Cold War was a state of tension and hostility among nations, without armed conflict between the major rivals. At first, the focus of the Cold War was Eastern Europe, where Stalin and the Western powers had different goals. Very different goals. Origins of the Cold War. Stalin had 2 goals in Eastern Europe. First, he wanted to spread communism into the area. Second, he wanted to create buffer zones of friendly governments as a defense against Germany, which had invaded Russia during World War I and again in 1941. As the Red Army had pushed German forces out of Eastern Europe, it left behind occupying forces. At wartime conferences, Stalin tried to persuade the West to accept Soviet influence in Eastern Europe. He bluntly stated, "Whoever occupies a territory also imposes his own social system. Everyone imposes his own social system as far as his armies can reach. It cannot be otherwise." The Soviet dictator pointed out that the United States was not consulting with the Soviet Union about peace terms for Italy or Japan, defeated and occupied by American and British troops. In the same way, Russia would determine the fate of Eastern European lands overrun by Red Army on its way to Berlin. Roosevelt and Churchill rejected Stalin's view, making him promise free elections in Eastern Europe. Stalin ignored the pledge, backed by the Red Army. Local communists in Poland, Czechoslovakia, and elsewhere destroyed rival political parties and even assassinated democratic leaders. By 1948, Stalin had installed a pro-Soviet communist government throughout Eastern Europe. A divided Europe. Churchill had long distrusted Stalin. As early as 1946, during a visit to the United States, he described the Soviet control of Eastern Europe as an iron curtain. An iron curtain dividing the continent. In the West, the Iron Curtain became a symbol of the Cold War. It expressed a growing fear of communism. More important, it described the division of Europe into Eastern and Western blocs. In the East were the Soviet-dominated communist countries of Eastern Europe. In the West were the Western democracies led by the United States. New conflicts develop. Like Churchill, President Truman saw communism as an evil force creeping across America and threatening countries around the world, including China. To deal with that threat, the United States abandoned its traditional isolationism. After World War I, it had to withdraw from global affairs, but after World War II, the nation took a leading role in the world stage. Stalin soon showed his aggressive intentions. In Greece, Stalin backed communist rebels who were fighting to overturn a right-wing monarchy supported by Britain. By 1947, however, Britain could no longer afford to be supported by Britain. In Greece, Stalin backed communist rebels who were fighting to overturn right-wing monarchy supported by Britain. By 1947, however, Britain could no longer afford to defend Greece. Stalin was also menacing Turkey and the Dardanelles, the strait linking the Russian Black Sea to the coast of the Mediterranean. The Truman Doctrine. Truman took action. On March 12, 1947, Truman outlined a new policy to Congress. "I believe that it must be the policy of the United States to support free people who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressures." This policy, known as the Truman Doctrine, would guide the United States for decades. It made clear that the Americans would resist Soviet expansion in Europe or elsewhere in the world. Truman soon sent military and economic aid and advisors to Greece and Turkey so that they could withstand the communist threat. The Truman Doctrine was rooted in the idea of containment, limiting communism to the areas already around Soviet control. George Kennan, the American statesman who first proposed this approach, believed that communism would eventually destroy itself. Stalin, however, saw containment as encirclement by the capitalist world that wanted to isolate the Soviet Union. The Marshall Plan. Post-war hunger and poverty made Western Europe lands fertile ground for communist ideas. To strengthen democratic governments, the United States offered massive aid packages called the Marshall Plan. Under it, the United States funneled food and economic assistance to Europe to help countries rebuild. Billions in American aid helped war-shattered Europe recover rapidly. President Truman also offered aid to the Soviet Union and its satellites, or dependent states. In Eastern Europe, Stalin, however, saw the plan as a trick to win Eastern Europe over to capitalism and democracy. He forbade Eastern European countries to accept American aid, promising help from the Soviet Union in its place. Division in Germany. Defeated Germany became another focus of the Cold War. Fearing the danger of restored Germany, the Soviet Union dismantled factories and other resources in its occupation zone and used them to help rebuild Russia. France, Britain, and the United States, however, decided to unite their zones of occupation, encouraging Germans to rebuild businesses and industries. Germany thus became a divided nation. In West Germany, the democratic nations allowed the people to write their own constitutions and regain self-government. In Eastern Germany, the Soviet Union installed a communist government tied to Moscow. Berlin Airlift. Stalin's resentment at Western moves to rebuild Germany as a democracy triggered a crisis over Berlin. The former German capital was occupied by all four victorious allies, even though it lay deep within the Soviet zone. In 1948, Stalin tried to force Western allies out of Berlin by sealing off every railroad and highway into the western sectors of the city. The Western powers responded to the blockade by mounting a round-the-clock airlift. For more than a year, cargo planes supplied Western Berliners with food and fuel. Their success forced the Soviets to end the blockade. Although West had won a victory, the crisis deepened hostilities. Military alliances. Tensions continued to grow. In 1949, the United States, Canada, and 9 Western European countries formed a new military alliance called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Members pledged to help one another if any one of them was attacked. In 1955, the Soviet Union responded by forming its own military alliance, the Warsaw Pact. It included USSR and 7 satellites in Eastern Europe. Unlike NATO, however, the Warsaw Pact was a weapon used by the Soviets to keep its satellites in order. What are the satellites? Tell me. The arms race. Each side of the Cold War armed itself to withstand an attack by the other. At first, the United States held an advantage in its control of nuclear power. But Stalin's top scientists were under orders to develop an atomic bomb of their own. They succeeded in 1949, and the arms race was on. For 4 decades, the superpowers spent fantastic sums to develop new, more deadly nuclear and conventional weapons. They invested still more to improve delivery systems, bombers, missiles, and submarines to launch these weapons of mass destruction. WMDs. This is 2001, before September. This book was copywritten, and the word weapons of mass destruction already being used, that I find interesting. That it was already being used before, September of 2001. I thought it was like a buzzword coined. Propaganda war. Both sides participated in a propaganda war. The United States spoke of defending capitalism and democracy against communism and totalitarianism. The Soviet Union claimed the moral high ground in the struggle against Western imperialism, yet linked to those stands, both sides sought world power. Looking ahead. In 1945, the world hoped for an end to decades of economic crisis. Bloody dictators and savage war instead, it faced new tensions. The Cold War would last for more than 40 years. Rivalry between the hostile camps would not only divide Europe, but also fuel crisis around the world. It would strain the resources of the United States and exhaust those of the Soviet Union, though it would not erupt into large-scale fighting between those two superpowers. Many small wars would break out, with the superpowers championing opposite sides. Meanwhile, the spread of ominous new weapons would raise the specter of global destruction. And here we are in 2023, hopefully with none of that on the horizon. Goodbye. God bless.